I knew the moment her smile widened that something inside my life was about to split open. There is a kind of pain that does not announce itself. It lands quietly, like a hand pressed to your chest, stilling the air before you even understand what has happened. That is what it felt like at the will reading. One grin, one moment, and everything I had poured my life into cracked straight down the middle. Betrayal does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes dressed as celebration, while you sit there realizing you are the only one who knows the truth that is about to break everything open. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. The morning the letter arrived, Gloucester felt like it always did in late autumn, wrapped in the damp breath of the Atlantic Ocean. My name is Nora Whitfield, and at 58, I had grown used to the rhythm of the tides brushing against the harbor and the creak of the cedar shingles on my small coastal house. I lived alone, just a few blocks from the docks, where gulls circled above fishing boats returning before sunrise. My life had settled into a quiet routine, built around restoring old furniture in my workshop and painting seascapes that captured the shifting moods of the water. The scent of varnish, mixed with salt air, had become my constant companion, steady and uncomplicated, unlike most things that involved people. I had carved out this existence after my divorce from Harold Whitfield a decade earlier. We had not parted in anger, only with the realization that two people could love each other and still fail at building a life together. Harold's world revolved around business travel, investor dinners, and endless ambition, while mine leaned toward the slow patience of hand tools and brushstrokes. His recent passing from heart failure had stirred memories, but not the dramatic grief others expected. Time had softened our story into something bittersweet, but peaceful. My son, Caleb, lived in Boston with his wife, Veronica Hale. He had once been the boy who combed these shores with me, pockets full of seashells and questions. Over the years, that warmth had thinned as he drifted toward Veronica's polished city life. She liked modern surfaces that gleamed, conversations about status, and plans that involved nothing ordinary. I had always sensed the way she looked at my workshop, at my old Subaru, at my well-worn sweaters, as if they revealed a flaw she hoped Caleb would grow out of. I never confronted her, but the distance it created between mother and son lingered like a draft through an unsealed window. The letter from the law office arrived in a cream envelope, stiff and formal, summoning me to the will reading for Harold. I stared at it for a long minute before opening it. I had not expected to be included. Harold and I had remained respectful, but our lives had diverged too far to imagine my presence in his final legal matters. Still, I felt compelled to go, not out of hope for inheritance, but for the dignity of closing a chapter. News traveled quickly in a small town. Neighbors muttered about Harold's properties and rumored holdings, the kind of talk that made me uncomfortable. I imagined Veronica's delight. She had always chased the shimmer of abundance, and the idea of a multi-million-dollar estate would fit neatly into the narrative she crafted online and in conversation. Caleb, caught in the slipstream of her expectations, would likely arrive dressed in quiet anxiety, unsure how to balance loyalty between his wife and his mother. The day of the reading, I prepared my workshop for closing, hung my apron, and stepped outside into the sharp breeze. I locked the door and walked to the edge of the harbor before leaving, letting the gray water settle my nerves. Then I drove toward Salem, the Subaru humming steadily along the coastline. The road carried me past maple trees stripped bare, past familiar stretches of Route 127 that held years of memories from family trips when life felt simpler. As I approached the courthouse, I spotted Caleb's car already parked, gleaming and far newer than anything I owned. Beside it, Veronica stepped out, smoothing her sleek coat with the confidence of someone who believed the world would always open for her. Her smile was bright, triumphant even, as if she had already won something. I inhaled slowly, grounding myself before opening my door. The air tasted like sea and cold stone. Whatever waited inside, I would face it with the same patience I brought to every piece of wood I ever restored. If you're still watching and this story has pulled you in, comment number 1 below so I know you're right here with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The interior of the Salem courthouse felt colder than the wind outside, as if the stone walls held centuries of restrained judgment. I stepped through the wooden doors and let my eyes adjust to the muted light drifting through the tall, arched windows. The place always carried a solemn mood, but on that morning it seemed especially heavy. Rows of polished wooden benches stood in rigid lines, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hearings. I could feel eyes turning toward me, some curious, some indifferent, and a few carrying that familiar glint of quiet superiority that certain members of Harold's extended family had perfected over the years. Veronica had chosen a front row seat beside Caleb, her posture straight, chin slightly raised, as though preparing for a coronation rather than a legal proceeding. She wore a fitted wool coat in an expensive shade of ivory, the kind that seemed to attract every beam of cold light in the room. Caleb sat beside her in a muted navy suit, his expression caught somewhere between discomfort and obligation. I felt a slight pang at how far that polite distance between us had grown, as if we had drifted into separate worlds without intending to. When Margaret O'Donnell entered, conversation softened into a hush. The lawyer was a woman in her 70s, with steady hands and a voice that carried authority without harshness. I had met her only once, briefly, during the divorce years ago. She seemed unchanged. She placed her leather folder on the table and announced that she would begin reading Harold Whitfield's last will and testament. Veronica subtly adjusted her hair and squared her shoulders, preparing herself for the moment she believed would affirm her place in the Whitfield hierarchy. The reading began with formal language, the standard acknowledgments and legal frameworks. Then came the first set of distributions. Margaret read aloud that Caleb and Veronica were to inherit 3 coastal vacation properties in the state of Maine. A soft wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Even without knowing the market, anyone could recognize the significance. Those properties had been rumored for years to be among Harold's most profitable holdings. Veronica's smile widened, a quiet but radiant show of triumph. She placed her hand over Caleb's in a gesture meant to look affectionate, but it carried the unmistakable undertone of victory. Caleb attempted a polite smile, but his eyes did not share the same confidence. He glanced in my direction once, almost apologetically, but the moment passed quickly. Veronica followed his gaze, and then looked back at me with an expression that mixed condescension and mock sympathy. I had seen that look before in subtle ways, but never so openly displayed. Then Margaret continued, shifting to the section of the will that addressed my name. Her tone remained neutral as she announced that Harold had left me ownership of a plot of land in Arizona. A handful of relatives exchanged puzzled looks. Someone in the back whispered something about desert wasteland, and another added a quiet remark about odd choices. Their words floated through the air like grains of loose sand, irritating but not surprising. I kept my expression composed. The sting was there, yes, but it was not new. Over the years, I had learned how to let such moments pass over me the way ocean water washes over stone. What mattered was maintaining my own sense of steadiness. Veronica appeared almost disappointed that I did not react more dramatically. She tilted her head and studied me as though waiting for a crack to appear. When the reading finally concluded, People began gathering their coats and murmuring among themselves. Caleb hesitated near the aisle, casting me one more uncertain look. As I moved toward the door, I stepped close enough to speak quietly. I leaned toward him and whispered, "Son, you truly have no idea." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they landed with weight. Veronica's face tightened, sharp with irritation, though I had not addressed her at all. I walked out of the courthouse into the sharp Salem wind. The cold hit my face with unexpected clarity. Despite everything that had just unfolded, I felt a strange sense of calm, as if the day had opened a door that had been waiting for years to be touched. There was more ahead, far more than anyone in that room could imagine. And for the first time, I felt ready for it. If you're still here and feeling the tension building, drop number 2 in the comments to let me know you're following every twist. Now, let's step into chapter 3. In the days following the will reading, Gloucester seemed to settle into a familiar rhythm, yet something beneath the surface of my routine shifted. The wind coming off the Atlantic Ocean felt sharper, almost intrusive, as if it carried whispers I was not prepared to hear. I returned to my workbench each morning, sanding old oak and brushing varnish over faded grains, but my thoughts kept circling back to the courthouse in Salem, to the polished smiles, and to the way Veronica had looked at me as though I had already been erased from the story of my own family. It was not the loss of property that unsettled me. It was the recognition that the distance between Caleb and me had grown into a void large enough for someone else to fill with her intentions. I did not have to search for updates about the 3 vacation houses in Maine. Veronica provided them willingly to the digital world. Her posts appeared everywhere, shared by acquaintances and screenshotted by neighbors who thought they were being subtle when asking whether I had seen them. She posed on balconies overlooking the rocky coastline, writing lengthy captions about legacy and well-earned blessings, the kind of statements drenched in self-celebration. The comments praised her elegance and vision, though I sensed the fragile hunger underneath her pride. I studied the images once or twice and then set my phone aside, telling myself that envy had no place in a heart that valued quieter things. Caleb called the following evening. His tone was gentle but strained, and I could hear something tight in his breathing before he spoke. He explained that the properties needed attention: a damaged roof, outdated heating, foundational reinforcement. He mentioned taxes and insurance as though they were passing inconveniences, but I could tell the numbers had begun to weigh heavily. Then, almost as if he feared breaking the spell of optimism Veronica had wrapped him in, he eased into the true purpose of the call. He wondered aloud whether selling the Arizona land might be a smart solution. He framed it as a way to take pressure off all of us, though we both knew the pressure fell mostly on him. When I told him I was not ready to make any decisions, silence passed between us like a cold current. He accepted my answer politely, but disappointment clung to his words. That night, I spread the papers from Harold's envelope across my kitchen table. I studied the map again, tracing the faint ink lines marking the parcel in Arizona. There were notes written in Harold's familiar handwriting, small and deliberate, the way he used to annotate business plans. Something in the pen strokes felt intentional, almost urgent. I realized I needed to see the land for myself, to understand why Harold had chosen it for me. I booked a flight for the end of the week. The change from Gloucester's icy breeze to the dry Arizona heat hit me the moment I stepped out of the Phoenix airport. The sun felt massive, pressing down with unfiltered brightness. I drove past stretches of desert broken by low shrubs and scattered cacti, the landscape both harsh and strangely calming. It felt like a place where truth could not hide. Meeting Dr. Lionel Perez only deepened that impression. He welcomed me into a modest environmental research office filled with maps, soil samples, and geological instruments. When he spoke about Harold, there was a note of respect in his voice. He explained that Harold had been investigating geothermal potential in the area, fascinated by the possibility of sustainable energy. He pulled out data sheets, thermal imaging, and environmental assessments that showed the land held an uncommon geothermal pocket, something of immense future value. I listened, absorbing each detail with growing astonishment. While everyone else had mocked the inheritance, Harold had left me something far more complex than a simple asset. He had left a key. Leaving the office, I watched the desert sky burn into shades of red and gold. The land stretched wide and quiet, full of untold possibility. For the first time since the will reading, I sensed change moving toward me with undeniable momentum. Whatever lay ahead, it was clear the story was only beginning. If you're still watching and the stakes are hitting deeper than you expected, comment number 3, so I know you're with me. Now we move into chapter 4. Caleb's voice had taken on a new cadence in the days that followed the reading of the will, a clipped, restless rhythm that slipped through every message he left on my phone. I kept working in my workshop in Gloucester, sanding the curve of an ashwood table leg, pretending I was not waiting for news from him. Yet each time the phone buzzed, I paused. I knew the main properties would show their true faces soon enough. Old coastal buildings had personalities, and none of them were generous. Trouble surfaced early. The first email detailed a leaking roof in one of the guest cabins, followed by a note about a broken furnace in the main lodge. A day later, there were photos of rotting steps and warped porch boards curling like tired fingers. The buildings had soaked up decades of storms, salt, and neglect. Harold had known that when he signed his will. Veronica, however, seemed convinced that throwing money at the structures would turn them into luxury retreats fit for glossy travel magazines. Caleb confessed during one late call that the tax assessment alone had startled him. Insurance for coastal storms added another blow, and a required safety inspection revealed issues with wiring and mold. Bills climbed without mercy. Contractors quoted numbers that made him swallow hard. I listened while the wind rattled my workshop windows, thinking how this was only the beginning. Veronica pushed harder. She wanted rebranding packages, digital campaigns, and a high-end interior designer from Portland. She spoke in terms of launch windows, target demographics, and curated guest experiences. None of it sounded like a way to save a struggling property. It sounded like a way to dress up a crumbling house for a party no one could afford to host. Caleb tried to strike a balance. He wanted to impress her, to keep up the illusion that the inheritance was a blessing and not a burden. I knew that tone. It was the same tone he used as a boy when he tried to convince me a broken vase would probably fix itself. This time, the stakes were far heavier. One evening, he called again. The fear had grown sharper. "Mom, maybe you should think about selling the land in Arizona, just while we stabilize things." His attempt at a casual tone only made the strain more obvious. I told him I needed more time. I told him decisions like that could not be rushed. I did not tell him that Dr. Perez had sent me updated maps of the solar resource potential that morning. I did not tell him the land was becoming more valuable with each passing month. Some truths needed silence to grow. After the call, I walked around the workshop in circles, unable to settle. I could hear my son's worry in every pause, feel the shadow of Veronica's impatience pressing him forward like a hand between his shoulder blades. He was trying to swim in waters too deep and churning too fast. Meanwhile, the main properties resisted every attempt at revival. Quick fixes revealed deeper problems. Low-cost contractors uncovered new failures each week. Guests canceled bookings as rumors of construction spread. Veronica's frustration sharpened into accusations. Then the email arrived. It was polite but threaded with desperation, asking me to reconsider the Arizona land. He wrote about timelines, bills, partnerships slipping through their fingers. The words trembled between the lines. I set the email aside and looked out toward the harbor lights flickering across the dark Gloucester water. There was a storm coming, one I had sensed long before this moment. Not the kind that battered shorelines, but the kind that struck families when old illusions finally gave way. On the table beside me lay the map of Arizona. I rested my hand on it, steadying myself for what was ahead. If you're still here, and the story has you wanting more, drop number 4 in the comments so I know you're staying with each reveal. Now, let's continue to chapter 5. The wind cut across the open stretch of coastal highway as I drove toward the lodge, the sky the color of worn metal. It had been weeks of hearing Caleb's voice tighten with every phone call, weeks of sensing that something inside him was beginning to fray. By the time the entrance sign came into view, half buried behind overgrown pines, I knew I would not like what waited for me. The main building hunched against the shoreline like an exhausted creature. Loose shingles clattered with each gust, and the porch sagged under the weight of too many storms left unanswered. Inside, the air carried the sour smell of dampness and old insulation. Extension cords snaked along the hallway floor. A cluster of workers patched ceiling beams, while another group argued over wiring that should have been replaced decades ago. The once beautiful lodge felt hollow, its charm drained away by years of neglect. Even the ocean outside the window looked colder, as if keeping its distance from the mess on shore. I found Caleb in a cramped office, reorganized from what used to be a linen closet. Hunched over a folding table, he rubbed his forehead while pages of invoices spread around him like fallen leaves. His shoulders slumped under the weight of expenses that seemed to grow every hour. He did not notice me until I stepped into the doorway. When he looked up, the exhaustion in his eyes startled me. He was still young, but stress had carved lines around his mouth that had not been there before. He tried to explain everything at once: the heating system that had failed during a cold snap, the contractor who refused to continue without a larger deposit, the incoming tax bills that had doubled after an updated property assessment. Veronica insisted they keep the highest-end upgrades on schedule. She believed the right image would draw wealthy guests, even if the lodge was falling apart behind the walls. Caleb admitted he could barely sleep, afraid of missing deadlines or losing workers. Each word revealed how cornered he had become. Then Veronica swept in. Her entrance felt rehearsed, as if she needed the world to know she was the one driving the vision. She carried a tablet displaying the newest design renderings, all bright colors and modern lines that clashed painfully with the building's rustic bones. She barely glanced at me before launching into a lecture about branding, revenue projections, and the untapped potential of the property. When she paused long enough to breathe, she accused me of refusing to help them, as though my land in Arizona existed solely to finance her ambitions. While she spoke, something on her tablet caught my eye. It was a budget sheet. The consulting fees listed did not belong to any outside firm. The company name matched a small business Veronica had registered months earlier, a detail I recognized only because I handled my own licensing paperwork. She had been charging the lodge for her own services, quietly siphoning funds while pretending to rescue Caleb from financial trouble. The realization cracked something open inside the room. Caleb stiffened when I pointed to the invoice. Confusion spread across his face, followed by disbelief. The confrontation erupted almost instantly. Veronica insisted she was simply recapturing value. She told Caleb he should appreciate her vision, that he lacked the courage to take risks, that he was missing his one chance to elevate himself. The words landed like blows, sharp and unforgiving. I stepped away from them and looked out the window toward the gray expanse of sea. When I turned back, both of them were staring at me, one angry, the other shaken. I chose my words carefully, letting them fall into the tense air. Caleb needed to hear them, even if he did not yet understand what they meant. I told him he had no idea what his father had truly left behind. The room went still. Veronica's expression faltered. Caleb stared at me as though seeing me for the first time in months. And in that charged silence, I knew the turning point had finally come. The unraveling had begun, and nothing about their lives would remain the same. The air outside the lodge felt heavier than the sky itself, as if the building behind me had exhaled all its tension into the cold coastal wind. I sat behind the wheel of my car without starting the engine, letting my hands rest on the steering wheel until the tremor in them settled. The confrontation had left a kind of echo inside me, a reminder that something deep within our family structure had cracked. Before I could gather my thoughts, my phone rang. Caleb's name lit up the screen, the sound of his voice thin and shaking, asking me to come back inside. When I re-entered the lodge, the earlier chaos had retreated into an eerie stillness. The workers had left. The storm surf pounded against the rocks, but the interior of the building was strangely quiet, like it was bracing for whatever came next. Caleb stood in the hallway outside the office, his expression raw in a way I had not seen since he was a boy, trying to hide the fact that something had gone terribly wrong. He began talking before he even looked at me. He said he had been ignoring signs for years, the way Veronica corrected him in public, how she took over every decision, how she dismissed his concerns as weaknesses. Now the patterns were clear. He saw how she pushed and pulled him depending on what she needed, how she made him feel small so she could feel indispensable. The weight of that realization pressed into his voice, and I felt the ache of it settle in my own chest. While he was gathering stray documents from the desk, a drawer slid open that Veronica had always kept locked. Inside were papers she had not intended for him to see. Among them was a draft contract describing an eventual transfer of the lodge's branding rights to a company she owned. The signature line for Caleb was positioned in a way that would make him the responsible party for all future debts. He stared at the page for a long moment, his eyes widening with disbelief before his hands began to tremble. I knew the moment he fully understood. His breath faltered. The truth had been sitting inches from him this whole time, and only now did he grasp the scale of the manipulation. I told him he was standing at a threshold, that continuing on this path meant surrendering not only his finances, but his sense of self. I did not mention the Arizona land directly, but I hinted that solutions existed outside the world Veronica built around him. His silence told me he understood more than he could say. He stepped into the corridor, standing between two doorways. Behind him, Veronica's rapid footsteps approached. In front of him, the door leading outside had drifted open, the sharp ocean wind filling the hallway with cold clarity. For a long second he closed his eyes, recalling a phrase Harold used to tell him, "A man must know what to keep and what to let go." When he opened his eyes again, the indecision that had tangled him for months was gone. He walked toward me. Veronica burst into the hallway like a storm surge, her voice rising in sharp, frantic waves. She demanded explanations, demanded that Caleb return to the office, demanded that he sign the next wave of renovation agreements. She accused me of poisoning him against her, accused Harold of ruining her life from beyond the grave, accused everyone but herself. Caleb listened, but something inside him had finally anchored. He answered her without raising his voice, explaining that he needed to step away and reevaluate everything. The calmness in his tone stunned her more than anger would have. She stopped mid-sentence, thrown off balance by the unexpected firmness. He retrieved his jacket and the folder containing documents he wanted to review. Then he walked past her and out into the cold evening. I followed him to the parking lot, aware that the moment we crossed that threshold, nothing would be the same again. Harold had known this day would come, and now Caleb had taken his first step toward the life he was meant to build. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of every decision, Comment number 6 below to let me know you're with me through the turning point. Now, let's move into Chapter 7. The drive back to Gloucester unfolded in a silence that felt almost sacred. The road stretched ahead in long gray ribbons, framed by pine trees trembling in the wind. Caleb stared out the passenger window for most of the trip, his reflection faint in the glass, his shoulders lowered in a way I had never seen before. It was the posture of someone who had finally stepped out of a burning house, but had not yet understood what he had saved or what had been lost. I kept my hand steady on the wheel and let the quiet settle between us like a blanket meant for healing rather than distance. Back in Maine, the chaos we left behind deepened. I heard about it through short messages from workers who had once contacted Caleb directly. Without him there to bridge the gaps, Veronica struggled to maintain control. Contractors who had already been frustrated began refusing to return. Notes about overdue payments circulated. The maintenance crew walked out after a dispute she tried to cover with promises she could not keep. The lodge's heating system failed during a cold snap, and pipes burst, flooding 2 of the cabins and the lower storage area. A local safety inspector issued a temporary shutdown order after discovering exposed wiring and structural instability. News traveled quickly along the coast. A small regional paper published a brief article about a historic lodge closed due to unsafe conditions, accompanied by a photograph of the building leaning against the winter wind like a wounded animal. Even from afar, the image made my heart sink. What Harold had once loved, what Caleb had hoped to salvage, now stood under the weight of neglect and ambition twisted in the wrong hands. Then came the legal blow. A lawyer sent an official warning to the lodge regarding misuse of business funds. The accusation named Veronica directly, citing the consulting fees she had funneled into her own firm. I did not need to imagine her reaction. I knew it well. Panic disguised as indignation. Blame scattered in every direction but inward. She tried to shift responsibility onto Caleb, even though he was no longer involved. Her silence toward him eventually confirmed one truth. She understood her position was collapsing faster than the lodge itself. Meanwhile, Caleb moved around my home like someone learning to breathe again. He carried the heavy quiet of a man confronting the shape of his own mistakes. He spent long hours at the kitchen table studying invoices, receipts, and maintenance reports he had brought back. His face tightened each time he saw another piece of evidence of how deeply the lodge's finances had deteriorated. He said little, but I sensed the ache inside him, the shame of not having recognized the deception sooner. Yet behind the pain was a slow-growing steadiness, like a new foundation forming under cracked soil. I watched from a distance, giving him space while staying close enough for him to feel my presence. The transformation in him was subtle but unmistakable. He began asking different questions, not about saving the lodge, but about saving himself. He considered what kind of man he wanted to be beyond Veronica's influence and beyond Harold's expectations. He looked inward in a way I had hoped for, but never dared to demand. The lodge continued to deteriorate. More calls came with updates about repairs no one could afford and damage no one could reverse. By the time authorities enforced a full closure, Veronica stood alone in the ruins of her own making. Caleb had been removed from liability, a fact that both protected him and forced him to face the emotional wreckage without distraction. One evening, I found him standing on the back porch, looking out at the dark expanse of the Gloucester shoreline. The wind pressed against him, but he did not shrink from it. For the first time, I saw in him a sense of release. Pain still clung to him, but it no longer defined him. The collapse had come, and it had cost him dearly. But in that quiet, cold moment, I glimpsed the beginning of his rebirth. The morning light drifted softly through the kitchen windows, settling over the wooden counters and the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee. Caleb had risen earlier than I expected. He moved quietly, measuring water, warming the pot, carrying himself with a calm I had not seen in weeks. The heaviness that once clung to his posture had loosened, replaced by something steadier, something almost clear. Gloucester had a way of slowing a person down, stripping away the noise so they could finally hear their own thoughts. It was doing that for him now. He sat across from me at the table, hands wrapped around the warm mug, eyes distant but no longer haunted. After a long stretch of silence, he began to speak about Harold. He described dusty roads in the southwestern deserts, road trips they took when he was a teenager, and the way Harold would pull over just to admire open land bathed in evening sun. He remembered his father's quiet lessons about resilience, about building something that could withstand time rather than impress people for a moment. These memories surfaced gently, as if they had been waiting for him to be ready to receive them again. I listened, feeling a subtle shift within him. The ruins of the lodge had forced him to confront what had been broken inside his marriage, but these memories were guiding him toward what could be rebuilt. He was no longer clinging to the past, nor drowning in regret. He was beginning to look forward. That was when I knew the moment had come. I asked him to follow me into my workspace. The room held maps, folders, and stacks of research I had guarded carefully since returning from Arizona. He stepped inside and paused. His gaze moved over the documents with growing curiosity. He seemed to understand without words that this was the part of Harold's legacy he had not yet been allowed to see. I began carefully. I explained that Harold had not chosen that Arizona land by chance. He had spent years studying it, meeting with environmental engineers, and analyzing data that pointed toward a long-term project. Caleb listened without interruption, absorbing every piece of information with a seriousness that reminded me of Harold. Then I handed him the map. He unfolded it slowly, tracing the marked points with his fingertips. The sunlight from the window fell across the paper, illuminating the lines Harold had once studied. Hope stirred behind Caleb's eyes, fragile but bright. I told him only what he needed for now, that real value often lies beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be seen. He inhaled deeply, as though that single thought connected everything: the lodge, Veronica, his father, and the path ahead. As the afternoon light shifted, Caleb remained seated by the window, the map resting in his hands. He did not know the full truth yet, but he could sense the doorway opening, and I knew the time was near to tell him everything. If you're still here and ready to see how everything finally comes together, drop number 8 in the comments so I know you're staying to the very end. Now, let's step into the final chapters. The late afternoon light slanted across the floor of my living room, turning the edges of the wooden furniture golden. It was the kind of light that made endings feel softer, as though the day knew how much had been carried within it. Caleb was already waiting in my workspace, sitting quietly beside the desk where I had laid out folders I had guarded for months. There was no tension in him now, only a calm readiness, as if he sensed the moment he had been walking toward was finally here. I placed the oldest folder in front of him and began from the beginning. I told him about Harold's trips to the Southwest years earlier, trips he once believed were casual business travels. In truth, Harold had been exploring land with Dr. Lionel Perez and a small team researching geothermal potential. He had grown fascinated by the possibility of a long-term, sustainable energy source that would outlast markets, storms, and the unpredictable nature of real estate. He knew he would not live long enough to complete the work, but he refused to abandon it. Then I explained why the main properties were left to him. Harold had wanted him to learn responsibility, to understand the cost of ambition built on unstable ground. But the part of the inheritance that held real weight, the land, the research, the opportunity, was entrusted to me, because Harold feared it would be swallowed by the wrong hands if revealed too soon. He trusted that I would protect it until Caleb was ready. I opened each folder one by one: geological analyses, projected energy valuations, licensing drafts, potential partnership agreements. The scale of the project unfolded across the table like a map to a future Harold had imagined long before any of us understood its significance. Caleb's eyes widened as he traced the documents, absorbing the magnitude of what he was seeing. It was not simply land. It was a foundation for a new life. His breath trembled, and then he bowed his head. Tears slid down his face, not from grief but from release. In that moment, he understood the meaning behind my quiet warning at the will reading. He understood his father's intention. He understood himself again. When he finally looked up, there was clarity in his expression. He said he wanted to return to Arizona with me, to continue what Harold had begun. He said Veronica belonged to another chapter of his life, one that had already closed. That evening, we stood together on the porch, the Gloucester shoreline stretching into the growing dark. The wind was cold, but neither of us felt it. Some legacies arrive not as possessions, but as the moment a person finds their way back to who they were meant to be. The desert sun was rising when our plane touched down in Arizona, casting long ribbons of gold across the horizon. This time, the light did not feel distant or harsh. It felt like an opening. Caleb sat beside me, looking out the window with a steadiness that had not been there before. There was no trace of the doubt that once shadowed him. What remained was quiet determination, the kind a person carries after choosing a new direction for their life. We drove through stretches of open land where red dust lifted behind the tires in soft curls. The landscape felt endless, a stark contrast to the narrow corridors of the lodge that had once trapped him. Here, everything seemed possible simply because nothing was pretending to be more than it was. Caleb looked around as if memorizing the lessons the land itself was offering. Dr. Lionel Perez greeted us with a warm nod at the field office. He spoke about Harold with a respect that came from shared effort, describing long days measuring soil temperature and consulting with specialists who understood the potential hidden beneath the ground. Caleb listened in silence, absorbing each detail with a reverence he had never shown his father before. It was not regret. It was recognition. I reached into my bag and gave Caleb the final envelope Harold had left for me. Inside was a brief note in Harold's handwriting, steady and familiar. The message explained that Caleb needed to find his own footing, that no inheritance could replace the lessons gained from struggle. Beneath the note was a photograph of the three of us on a Gloucester beach, taken when Caleb was small. On the back, Harold had written that the true legacy was not the land, but the bond that might be rebuilt once illusions fell away. Caleb stood on the Arizona soil with the photo pressed gently in his hand. The wind rose around him, carrying warmth instead of cold. In that moment, I saw the future he had reclaimed for himself, one shaped not by ambition borrowed from others, but by clarity earned through hardship. Some gifts do not appear until everything else has fallen apart. Some endings do not close a door so much as clear a path, and the journey that leads there often reshapes us in ways we never expect. When illusions fall away, what remains is the quiet truth that real security grows from honesty, grit, and the courage to face ourselves without the shields we once depended on. Hard seasons have a way of revealing what comfort only hides, and loss can become a teacher when we choose to meet it with open eyes instead of fear. In the end, it is never the size of an inheritance that defines a life, but the wisdom gained from learning what truly sustains us. Thank you for spending this time with the story. If it stirred something in you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Please follow and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter we explore together.